In a quiet Colorado town, in the middle of a sunny afternoon, Camille Johnson found herself alone in a park in Fort Collins. Children's laughter echoed in the air, families lounged under the trees, and runners dashed down the trail. Camille, a respected lawyer, was taking advantage of this well-deserved break. The thick book she held in her hands seemed to help her detach herself from the demands of her job. It was a rare moment of tranquility, a luxury in his frenetic life. Her gaze was lost from time to time in the golden glow that bathed the park, and a gentle wind caressed her hair. She needed this calm to recharge her batteries, to prepare to once again face the world of law, often brutal, often unjust. The heat of the afternoon enveloped everything, and Camille closed her eyes for a moment to savor this escape. The tasks of the day, cases to deal with, clients to defend, endless legal battles, seemed distant, almost unreal in this scene of peaceful calm. She felt at peace, a feeling she hadn't experienced in too long. However, the tranquility of the afternoon was shattered by the sudden arrival of a police car, its tires screeching on the pavement. Camille turned her head when she heard the sirens, watching as the patrol car parked near the trail, away from the areas where families were relaxing. Two officers got out, their eyes immediately fixed on Camille, the only person alone in the immense park. The sunlight was fading, casting longer shadows on the grass, and the atmosphere seemed charged with a new tension, as palpable as the heat of the day. Without warning, one of the police officers approached, his face impassive but determined. He wore a commanding expression, eyes fixed on Camille as if she was already guilty of something. "Madam, you must follow us," he ordered in a firm voice. There was no explanation, no context, only a categorical demand. Camille, calm and composed, responded without letting herself be destabilized. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. The situation made no sense. The police had no reason to intervene in a public place where hundreds of people gathered every day. But a tension, imperceptible at first, rose in the air, like a dark cloud ready to burst. The police's questions, at first banal, became more and more insistent. "Why are you here? What are you doing?" the second agent asked, a glint of suspicion in his eyes. Camille looked at them without blinking, trying to remain calm despite the anxiety that was rising within her. She knew that this situation made no sense, but she also knew that every word, every gesture, had to be measured. "I'm resting," she replied calmly. "I'm just here to enjoy some peace and quiet." But the policemen did not seem convinced. Their gazes had hardened, as if his mere presence was a crime in itself. Camille answered them peacefully, showing them her driver's license, as if to demonstrate that she had nothing to hide, that she was an ordinary citizen, with no reason to be the subject of such suspicious treatment. She tried to remain calm, but the air was gradually taking on an unbearable tension. Her hands tightened around the book she had been holding moments earlier, a gesture that betrayed the nervousness she was beginning to feel. The police, far from being convinced, did not seem willing to listen. They stood there, one in front of her, the other at her side, blocking her access to the exit of the park. They weren't just curious anymore. Their attitude had become more threatening. "You're not allowed to be here alone? Don't you have something to hide?" they insisted, their voices rising slightly, an implication in each word. Camille could feel the situation spiraling out of control. She tried to remain calm, refusing to respond to baseless accusations. "I've already explained to you what I'm doing here. There's no reason for you to detain me," she replied firmly. Their faces had hardened, one of the police officers taking a step forward, as if to intimidate further. Camille, in a burst of dignity, refused to give in. "Before you ask me any more questions, you must explain to me what you are trying to do. What is the reason for this interrogation? What did I do?" The question, although simple, seemed to make them lose their calm. The police officers exchanged furtive glances, a growing tension marked by heavy silences. They became more and more insistent, their accusations growing stronger without any concrete evidence. One of them, more agitated, leaned closer to her, and in a louder voice, said, "You probably feel untouchable because you're a lawyer, but that doesn't protect you here. You have something to reproach you for, isn't it?" The condescending tone and verbal aggression shook Camille, but she was not going to let herself be provoked. Suddenly, in a hasty and uncontrolled movement, one of the police officers brutally grabbed her arm, pulling her towards him. The shock was immediate, and Camille felt her body tense under the man's violent impulse. The sound of rattling handcuffs echoed through the still air of the park, tearing through the tranquility like a clap of thunder. Camille, at the moment, felt her mind waver. The humiliation was not simply in the act itself, but in the way she was treated, as if her presence there, in this peaceful park, was suspect in itself. As if being alone, being a black woman, was proof of guilt. The tumult attracted the attention of passers-by. A few curious glances turned their way, then a phone went up, the silent recording of the moment. Murmurs arose among the spectators, and some became bolder, their voices joining in with the growing scene of chaos. Camille, feeling humiliated but determined not to give in to injustice, felt deep anger when she saw the handcuffs close around her wrists. She would not allow herself to be silenced. She wouldn't let herself be an example of submission. Imprisoned in the police car, the engine roaring like a bad omen, Camille lost herself in her thoughts. Far from the accusatory gaze, she tried to rationalize the event. This afternoon, which she had envisioned as a simple break, had turned into an ordeal. This moment of tranquility, which became a brutal turning point in her life, was not going to define her. She promised herself not to let this ordeal break her, not to forget that she had a right to have a say, a right to justice. But deep inside her, something changed. She understood that as a woman, as a black person, every day in this justice system was never as easy as it seemed. The following hours were marked by humiliations in the police station. Camille, deprived of any recourse, undergoes incessant interrogations, body searches and degrading gestures, each of which adds to the humiliation of the moment. The police treated her like a culprit even before looking for any evidence, their incessant questions becoming more and more intrusive, as if each word was aimed at breaking her. "Where exactly were you before you came here? Why are you alone?" they repeated insistently, as if the solitude of a black woman was in itself suspect. Every question, no matter how trivial, seemed like a blow to his dignity. The fingerprints were taken with mechanical coldness, as if his identity were nothing more than a detail to be catalogued in a procedure. The physical search that followed, although in accordance with protocols, seemed to him to be an act of pure dehumanization. The gestures were more violent than necessary, the police officers' looks full of judgment. The cold of the metal walls, the unpleasant smell of the cell, the harsh light of the pale neon lights, everything seemed designed to reduce her to a simple worthless body. The minutes stretched like hours, each moment adding weight to the heaviness of injustice. However, in this narrow cell, Camille did not let herself be crushed. Time passed slowly, but in his mind, thoughts flowed with unexpected clarity. His dignity had not been completely erased. She knew she had to fight, for herself, for those who were unable to speak out against daily injustices. His thoughts turned to these invisible faces, these people who suffered the same humiliation, the same oppression without ever being able to cry out. But she was going to scream. Not right away, not now, but she was going to do it. His only weapon at that moment was his determination. She was not ready to let it happen, to accept the symbolic violence she was experiencing. She promised herself not to put herself through this ordeal. She would hold on whatever the cost, because her struggle was greater than what she was experiencing there, behind these cold walls. Hours later, after what seemed like an eternity, Camille was finally released on bail. When she finally found herself outside, the cool night air seemed an immediate relief, but it did nothing to quell the anger bubbling inside her. She breathed deeply, feeling the wind caress her face, a slight respite before reality returned. Her legs were shaking, fatigue and stress had caught up with her, but she didn't give in. She turned her gaze to Marissa, who was waiting there, a look of mixed worry and relief on her face. She approached her, arms opening in a silent, but understanding welcome. "I will fight, Marissa," Camille said, her voice firm, but the pain in her eyes was palpable, betraying everything she had endured. "I won't let this go." These words were not just a promise to her friend, but an oath she made to herself, an affirmation of her own resilience in the face of injustice. She stood up, ready to see this fight through, because it was no longer just a question of her own case. It was the fight of a lifetime, a fight for justice, for the truth, for those who could not defend their honor as she was going to do. His pain, however strong it might be, would not be greater than his desire for justice. At home, Camille immersed herself in drafting the complaint, a heavy but inevitable task. The words she wrote down were full of rage and determination, but also an unwavering desire for justice. Each sentence she wrote was intended to denounce not only the abuses of the police, but also to draw attention to the systemic abuses of justice, a system which, too often, left the most vulnerable at the mercy of the authorities. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She wasn't naive. But it was a fight she had to fight, for herself and for those who had no voice. The support of the community, which had quickly formed around her, brought unexpected comfort. The video of the incident, broadcast online, made the rounds on social networks. Camille's face, calm but determined despite the humiliation, resonated with many people who recognized themselves in her story. Messages of solidarity flooded into her accounts, from strangers who thanked her for taking this battle head-on. This strengthened her, and little by little, a real movement of support was built around her. Civil rights associations, community groups, and even co-workers encouraged him in his approach. Camille was no longer alone. This support had become his shield and his sword in the coming struggle. Little by little, she built her file. She was methodical. Nothing should escape her. Each testimony, each surveillance video, each document, each message of support became a piece of the puzzle. No detail was too small. She compiled everything, relentlessly. The pressure was enormous, but every step she took, every new piece she added to her file, strengthened her conviction. She knew this fight was going to be long, but there was no turning back. Her cause was now much bigger than her. She had become the symbol of resistance against injustice, a voice for those who, like her, were invisible and ignored. Systemic discrimination was not simply a matter of dealing with it individually. It was about highlighting the inequalities that are deeply rooted in society. Camille had made a vow to herself. She would not just win for herself, but for all those who were too often left behind. The days passed, and as the affair grew, Camille felt the pressure build. She was no longer simply a lawyer seeking to do justice. She had become the face of a fight that went beyond her own case. Every message, every media reaction, every article that came out reinforced the idea that this matter did not only concern her, but a multitude of invisible victims of systemic injustices. She found herself carrying the burden of those who usually did not have the luxury of defending themselves in a system that always seemed to tilt in favor of those with power. When the summons for a judge to examine the police officer's case arrived, Camille felt a strange chill. She knew this moment would mark a turning point. And it did, but not in the way she imagined. Due to an administrative imbroglio, the case file was assigned to herself. Camille Johnson, a respected lawyer, found herself having to judge the case that had plunged her into the abyss. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel irony in store for him. She never imagined that one day she would be in this position, a standoff against the institution to which she belonged. It was a surreal situation, and yet, there, in the cold and impersonal reality of the justice system, she found herself facing a major challenge. Not only to do justice, but also to overcome the temptation to let her emotions dictate her decisions. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was overflowing with people. Journalists, civil rights activists, community members, and just the curious had flocked to witness this watershed moment. Murmurs filled the room, creating a tense, almost electric atmosphere of expectation. The benches were full, eyes riveted on Camille as she entered the room, dressed in her lawyer's dress. Upright, determined, she moved forward, her approach imbued with a silent dignity that commanded respect. Facing her, the police officers, those who had brutalized and humiliated her a few weeks earlier, sat, their posture rigid, their faces frozen in an expression of calculated impassivity. For them, this hearing seemed like a formality, a simple administrative obstacle that they hoped to overcome without too much difficulty. But for Camille, this day was much more than an audience. It represented a moment of truth, an opportunity to confront a system that had too often turned its back on the most vulnerable. She knew that this fight went far beyond her own story. It was a chance to show everyone that even the most rigid institutions could be held accountable, that no one, not even law enforcement officers, was above the law. The first hours were marked by palpable tension. The police officers' defense lawyers tried to downplay the facts, speaking of misunderstandings, misinterpreted protocols, and human errors. But Camille, armed with solid evidence and imperturbable calm, methodically dismantled each argument. The videos of bystanders, the testimonies of eyewitnesses, and even the contradictions in the statements of the police formed a damning picture. She spoke with a clarity and precision that left no room for doubt. Every word, every sentence, carried the weight of his determination and personal experience. It was more than a legal plea. It was a powerful denunciation of a system which, for too long, had allowed such abuses. In the room, the spectators were captivated. Some discreetly wiped away tears as they listened to Camille calmly but emotionally recount the way she had been treated that day. Others nodded in silent solidarity. Camille's every word sounded like a call for justice, a voice raised for those who, like her, had been silenced. The most poignant moment came when she stopped, stared at the judges and said, "This trial is not just mine. It represents an opportunity for this institution to prove that it can be just, that it can defend the principles it claims to embody. It's not just a personal matter. It is a fight for those who, in the shadows, have never had the chance to be heard." His voice, although firm, trembled slightly with emotion, but that made his words all the more powerful. The police officers seemed uncomfortable for the first time. Their facade of confidence cracked slightly under the pressure of evidence and the accusatory gaze of the public. Their lawyers were agitated, looking for ways to rectify a situation that was clearly beyond their control. But it was too late. Camille had taken control of this audience, not out of arrogance or revenge, but out of inner strength and a truth that no one could deny. When the main judge announced that the case would be deliberated, the room held its breath. The tension was at its peak, but Camille stood straight. She had done everything in her power. She had fought with dignity and honesty, and no matter the verdict, she knew she had already won a victory. She had dared to stand up in the face of injustice, and she had shown the world that it was possible to resist. As she left the courtroom, spontaneous applause broke out among the spectators. Camille, although tired, felt a wave of emotion invade her. It wasn't just her struggle, it was that of thousands of people, and in this moment, she was no longer alone. In their looks, in their gestures, she saw a solidarity that transcended social and cultural barriers. She smiled weakly, knowing that the road was still long, but convinced that the world, little by little, could change.